You think you know the story of Adam and Eve and their co-stars, the snake, the tree, and the apple, but you don't know a fig leaf about it. Here's some fruit from the tree of knowledge, if you dare.
The biblical texts are written either in Hebrew or in Aramaic or in Greek, but every translation is an interpretation.
So with the Old Testament, we're talking about Hebrew mostly, but there's some original Aramaic there for sure, and plenty of room for some potential mistranslations. For example, we all know Eve was created from one of Adam's ribs, except maybe not. The Hebrew word Selah appears 40 times in the Bible, but the only time it's translated as rib is when Eve shows up. Otherwise, it refers to the side of something or something hanging off the torso of an upright human. Here we go. Enter the dong bone theory. According to Dr. Zioni Zevit, who holds the title of Distinguished Professor of Biblical Literature at American Jewish University, we need to be thinking a little lower. That's right, Dr. Zevit believes Eve was actually created from Adam's baculum. The penis bone is extremely common in mammals, including other primates, but human males are missing this piece of kit. Why? Well, if God took that bone from Adam to make Eve, then his descendants would presumably have boneless penises. Think about it. Men have an even number of ribs, but no baculum, so it stands to reason, Zevit says, that that's the bone God used to make woman. People weren't exactly thrilled with this theory. An incensed Times of Israel reader wrote in saying, "That is plainly not a Bible teaching. I do not need and will not read articles that damage my faith or attempts to cause me to doubt what I know is the truth from the Bible." In other words, she considers Zevit's theory to be a fallacy. Get it? Moving on. Like much of the Bible, Genesis includes elements seemingly borrowed from other cultures and religions. When it comes to the story of Adam and Eve, some key bits are cribbed from the Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh. But how? Well, back before the Hebrews were called Jews, they were living in exile in Babylon. That's when they learned the Enuma Elish creation myth, which involved a single all-powerful god. But it was the myth of Gilgamesh that really stuck. In that story, Gilgamesh, the hero, gets a hold of an herb that gives him immortality, but he gets distracted and an opportunistic snake eats the thing. In the same story, the gods create a male companion so Gilgamesh won't be lonely, but then a woman enters the picture and messes it all up. The companion realizes he's naked and boom, there go the two buddies' idyllic lives living in harmony with nature, the animals, and each other. But that doesn't mean the Hebrew version isn't original. The Genesis stories were written after the end of the Babylonian exile. This is about 3,400 years ago if you're trying to do the math in your head, and we're talking written. Yes, there were oral versions prior to that. How long? No one is sure. But the Hebrew people were making their own mythology, a creation story, and solidifying themselves as a people. And when you think about which parts of the old myths they kept and which they changed, it tells you what was important to the Hebrew people at the time. If you read Genesis thoroughly, you'll notice God creates the universe and everything in it twice, and there are places where the two accounts directly contradict each other.
You're confusing me.
Yeah, it's weird. The two stories are written in two totally different styles with different theological goals. The obvious conclusion is that they were written by two different people at two different times for two different reasons and combined later. This presents a major problem for any biblical scholars who believe Genesis is one story written completely by Moses. There have been people who've gone to great lengths to try to meld the two versions. Some even decided Adam was a hermaphrodite. That's right. In the first creation story it says, "And God created man to his own image. To the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." Some early Christian theologians interpreted this to mean that Adam and Eve had serene undifferentiation. They were both sexes. Now, as you can imagine, many church leaders were uncomfortable with this idea, but the theory stuck around for centuries anyway. Ask anyone what fruit Adam and Eve ate that ticked God off, and they'll tell you it was an apple.
An apple. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Eat the damn apple.
But spoiler alerts, the Bible never actually says what kind of fruit it was. In English translations, it's just the fruit on the tree, and it's just as vague in the original language. The Hebrew word used is peri. This could mean almost any fruit, and Jewish scholars have argued for a fig, grape, citron, pomegranate, or even wheat, which isn't a fruit and doesn't grow on a tree, but whatever. So what's with the apple thing? Well, in the 4th century AD, Pope Damasus decided the Bible needed to be translated into Latin. The scholar Jerome was given the job, and when he got to the mention of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he decided to zhuzh up the prose a bit, punch it up, as it were. You see, in Latin, malus means evil, but it also means apple, so the fruit of the tree that let Adam and Eve know evil was an apple, or evil. 4th century comedy, folks, and the idea went sort of viral 13 centuries later. In the 17th century, John Milton really cemented the apple idea in Paradise Lost by calling the forbidden fruit an apple twice. After that, artists all pretty much depicted Adam and Eve eating an apple, and here we are. Evolution, or God if you prefer, gave humans big skulls and slim hips, so childbirth is extremely painful. Fortunately, we now have lovely drugs to take some of that agony away.
Give me drugs, give me the drugs!
But even before epidurals, there were plenty of ways to make birthing a baby less horrible for the mother. But men said, nah, hold off on that. Eve messed everything up by eating the forbidden fruit, which means women need to suffer. Forever.
Why shouldn't we eat it? Looks all right to me.
God does punish Eve in Genesis 3:16 when he says, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." Except, hang on a minute. The word for sorrow means labor, toil, or work, everywhere else in the Bible. And it's only when talking about giving birth that translators decided that sorrow also included pain. Women in labor probably don't care about the deep theological implications, they just want the pain to stop. But religious men through the centuries have sure given it a lot of thought. According to the Journal of Anesthesia History, Martin Luther wrote that women should be thrilled to gloriously suffer to bring forth babies, and a male New England pastor once opined that alleviating the pain of women in childbirth would, quote, deprive God of the pleasure of their deep, earnest cries of help. Martin Luther also ate a spoonful of his own poop daily, so he might not be the best advice giver. Anyway, this theological argument resulted in a huge backlash in the 1800s when pain medication started being used during labor. Since God allegedly demanded that there be pain, taking it away was a sin, and some people still feel this way, even today. Adam and Eve aren't Christian or Jewish exclusive. They actually make an appearance in the Quran. But the Islamic version of their story has some key differences. It starts out pretty much the same. God makes Adam and Eve and tells them that they can't eat from the special tree. Then Satan comes along and tricks them into eating from that tree. But in this version, Satan tricks them both, not just Eve. They both eat from the tree, and they're both equally to blame. Nowhere in the Quran is Eve a temptress, nor does God punish her for what she did. And there is no concept of original sin in Islam either. Adam and Eve were punished for what they did, but that punishment was for them alone, not to all of humanity forever. Now, throughout history, people have set out to find the Garden of Eden. And it's a big task since Genesis gives us only one clue, that Eden was located where one river splits into four.
For centuries, people have looked everywhere from the depths of the Persian Gulf to rural Missouri and even the planet Mars.
Sure, Mars sounds bonkers, but Missouri? This is a theory put forth by none other than Latter-day Saints founder Joseph Smith himself. In fact, the Mormon Church owns the land today where they say Eden was located. Christopher Columbus thought he was close when he landed on Hispaniola, and even closer in Venezuela. The explorer David Livingstone declared Eden to be at the source of the Nile, although he was out of his mind with malaria when he said it. In 1881, Methodist minister William Warren wrote a book explaining how he figured out Eden was located at the North Pole. But almost at the same time, other people were publishing proof that it was outside Damascus or in California's Santa Clara Valley. There have been claims that Eden was in Ohio, Florida, and Mongolia, and some residents of the Seychelles were hoping to rediscover Eden, alleged to be on one of their islands, in time for Queen Elizabeth II's visit in 1972. Spoiler, they didn't. Other theories include Azerbaijan, Armenia, Bahrain, South Carolina, Somalia, or underwater in the Persian Gulf.
There's 4 rivers coming out of Eden to water the garden. So you can see the garden in the center of Eden and 4 rivers coming from Eden into it.
The most commonly accepted location over the years has been Iraq. Not that it's really that simple. If you go to Iraq looking to visit paradise, you'll have your choice of 2 competing real Gardens of Eden. But don't sleep on that Armenia theory. We've talked about this before in a video, but the short version is that Eastern Turkey is basically ancient Armenia, and they have rivers and pomegranates. A lot fits. Lots of people assume that all Christians believe the Genesis creation story is absolutely literal and that Adam and Eve actually existed. There definitely are people who believe that, but in America at least, they're dwindling. According to a 2024 Gallup poll, only 37% of adult American Christians surveyed believe God created Adam and Eve as fully human individuals about 10,000 years ago, while 34% believed evolution happened, but with God's guidance in some way. And both of these responses have been trending downward since the end of the 20th century. In fact, 24% of the group surveyed believed in a God-free evolution process. That number has more than doubled since 1999, so for the moment, science appears to be gaining ground. Trinity Western University's biology professor Dennis Venema told NPR, "It's actually an opportunity to have an increasingly accurate understanding of the world, and from a Christian perspective, that's an increasingly accurate understanding of how God brought us into existence. They may actually be following what the original writers of Genesis had in mind. Christian scholars have long believed it was originally written as allegory and poetry rather than history. It wasn't until St. Augustine started thinking deep theological thoughts about creation in the 4th century AD that anyone suggested the story of the snake and the rib and the apple of evil be taken literally." For almost 400 years post-Jesus, early Christians didn't have a set book of theology. Anyone who wanted to could come up with their own stories or write their own version of history to help create and explain this new religion. And one of the subjects that interested early Christian authors was the children of Adam and Eve. Various books discuss the daughters of Adam and Eve, giving 2 of them names and full life stories. But when it came to the now official Bible and the Torah, you might think it's canon that Adam and Eve only had 3 children, Cain, Abel, and Seth. Or Seth, he's always the forgotten one. But even Genesis mentions many more children for the pair, although it gives no other details. But Genesis 5:4 is crystal clear, reading, "The days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters."
And all these holy people got themselves begat through original sin?
The pluralization of these words indicates that there would have been at least 2 more children of each sex, bringing the minimum number of kids they had to 7. But as Adam lived to be 800 years old, it's not much of a stretch for biblical scholars who are so inclined to assume that there were plenty more. It can be argued that a certain short passage in Genesis, where a talking snake convinces Eve to eat from a special tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden, is one of the most impactful stories in existence.
It was the snack that changed history.
It's been used for any number of theological, social, and political purposes throughout millennia. But the actual story is a lot more complicated than you may have been taught in Sunday school. First, while Genesis is clear that the animal involved is a snake, it never says anything about the snake being the devil. This detail was apparently added by later Jewish and Christian writers, and obviously the Islam version we mentioned before, and seems like a logical inference until you think about it a little more deeply. God had just created the animals after all, so did he create the snake as Satan? How far ahead was he thinking? And if so, what does that mean for the story? Some argue that the snake isn't even a key part of the original story and doesn't deserve all the attention later retellings give to it. It's also significant that Eve never actually hears the commandment from God not to eat from the tree. She only got a paraphrased version from Adam. So when the snake appears and sweet talks her with good conversation and the art of persuasion, Eve's convinced it's a good idea to taste the fruit of knowledge. Knowledge is a good thing after all, isn't it?
You can't see what's so bad about knowing the difference between good and evil anyway.
Many Christian denominations believe in the concept of original sin, which is the idea that all humans are born already in a sinful state. How can a baby fresh from the womb already have done wrong? Because Adam and Eve passed on their terrible sin of disobedience in the Garden of Eden to every single person who came after them, or so the theory goes.
Why did Adam eat the apple when God told him not to? He was willing to deny God to please Eve, and that's the ultimate of romance.
But original sin wasn't actually a thing for the first 400 or so years after Jesus. In fact, many early Christian theologians, including the influential Bishop Saint Irenaeus of Smyrna, argued that if humans ever had original sin, Jesus erased it when he was crucified. One of the early discussions among church fathers was about baptizing infants. Jesus was baptized as an adult, so why would it be important for present-day Christians to be baptized as babies instead? Many theologians tied this back to original sin, presenting deep philosophical explanations of how Adam's soul most likely passed it on. Finally, St. Augustine of Hippo wrote the defining works on the question of original sin around AD 400. Working with the incorrect assumption that infant baptism had always been required, he retconned original sin to give a reason for the whole thing. And from then on, bam, original sin became a Christian fact, even though it wasn't. Even after Christians settled on the concept of original sin, they weren't done discussing just how much Adam and Eve had screwed humanity by eating that one piece of indeterminate fruit. Christian theologians have argued the idea that 4 wounds resulted from Adam and Eve's fall from grace. Those would be ignorance or spiritual darkness, malice, weakness of the spiritual variety, and concupiscence. a juicy word that just means misdirected desires, but not just sexual ones. Greed, thirst for fame, and pretty much anything that isn't given by God falls under wound number 4.
What do you call this thing?
It's a bed.
In other words, every important thing that makes us human was deeply wounded by that one healthy snack. In around 700 AD, the Venerable Bede started tossing these ideas around, but it was Thomas Aquinas who really ran with them in his seminal Christian work, Summa Theologica.
The temptations that bedeviled man in the beginning still bedevil him today.
What this means for Christians is that basically you're doomed to fail and eventually die. Various Christian denominations have different ways of fixing this problem, including good works and baptism. They can't solve the death problem though, so the idea became that even though you will expire, your soul will not. The story of Adam and Eve is absolutely stuffed with what are effectively dad jokes. Take a look at this one from Genesis 2:5. After God creates everything except humans, it reads, "There was not a man to till the ground." Get it? No gardeners. Groan, right? And then the author really brings the punchline home with a callback to the joke in Genesis 3:19 when God tells Adam he's going to be punished for his disobedience.
In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken.
Hilarious, right? No. Why would anyone think that's funny? It's complicated. Remember, Genesis was originally written in Hebrew and the jokes don't work in English, or most other languages. And it seems that translators over the centuries didn't think it was important to keep the puns.
It's not funny.
But in Hebrew, those puns have real meaning that helped readers interpret the text. A close English equivalent would be if Adam's name was translated as earthling. So when the text mentions Adam and the earth together, it would be saying something along the lines of, one day you're going back to the earth, but until then you are going to farm the earth, earthling. This gives those lines deeper meaning even today. And in a sustenance society like that of the Hebrews, who lived in an arid region, this would have been a very overt reference to how difficult and finite life is. According to Gallup, as of 2024, 58% of US adults believe in human evolution, either with God's help or without. On the other hand, 37% of adults in the US believe in the biblical story of creation. Those creationists take the Adam and Eve story literally and believe they were real people who existed at most 10,000 years ago. But where does that date come from? The Bible, particularly the Old Testament, loves a good genealogy. Just take a look at the infamous so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so parts. And based on the 2 lists of who begat whom in Genesis, which cover the generations between Adam and Abraham, plus the many other begat lists that ultimately culminate with Jesus, historical theologians have settled on about 4000 BC as the date of the creation of the earth. However, for various reasons, others believe the genealogies are missing some names. A lot of names, in fact, and that date could be as much as 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. But theologians have gotten even more specific. Around AD 700, the Venerable Bede wrote that the creation took place in the spring. Fair enough. But in 1642, rabbinical scholar John Lightfoot famously determined that man was created by the Trinity on October 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning. So Adam was a Scorpio, apparently. And in 1650, Archbishop James Ussher calculated that Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden on Monday, November 19th. In other words, nobody knows the real timeline. The men featured in Genesis must have been doing plenty of exercise and getting their fiber because they lived a long, long time. Genesis 5 lists a bunch of their ages when they died, and it says Adam made it to 930 years old, while his son Seth was 912 before he kicked the bucket. For those people who believe the stories in Genesis are literal, this presents an interesting conundrum. How could Adam and his progeny live almost 1,000 years when so few people these days even make it to 100? Some religious scholars have proposed that the vitality of creation, combined with the Garden of Eden's high-quality food and even the fruit of the tree of life, along with the act of leading a pious life, promoted an exceptional lifespan. Others have taken a more scientific stance, blaming our shorter modern lifespans on genetic deterioration that has been ongoing since the days of Adam. And then there's a hint in the biblical narration just prior to the Great Flood. Genesis 6:3 states, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. In other words, humans were supposed to live a long, long time, but once we became so wicked that God had to send a flood, he reduced our lifespans as punishment. But he still wasn't satisfied, apparently, because God then reduced lifespans even further until settling on 70 years, according to Psalm 90, which states, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10. In case you forgot, a score is 20 years, so 7 years is just 87 years, but with more flair. Anyway, many Christians believe that Adam's lifespan wasn't meant to be literal, but was symbolic, and once represented something important and extremely complex and convoluted in ancient Hebrew numerology. According to Genesis, the first ever death on earth was when Cain murdered his brother Abel, but it would be many hundreds of years, when Adam died at the ripe old age of 930, before the world saw its first death from natural causes. Genesis is light on the details around this momentous event, which means other Jewish writers, as well as some early Christian ones, stepped in to fill the gaps. One such book of unknown provenance that covers this topic is The Life of Adam and Eve, also known as the Apocalypse of Moses, the ancient Greek translation of the Adam and Eve story. In this version, Adam is old and not feeling great. He says God has hit him with 72 different ailments over his lifetime, including eye pain and hearing loss. But now Adam knows he's dying, and while Eve and Seth try to save him with oil from the Garden of Eden, it's a lost cause. An angel tells them Adam had just 3 days to live, and reminds them that because they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, now humans all have to die.
This is what you might call the tree of knowledge. It separates the men from the boys.
Come on, Eve! The memory ticks Adam off all over again, and even though he's on his deathbed, he makes sure Eve knows it's all her fault that it's happening, saying, "Eve, what hast thou wrought in us? Thou hast brought upon us great wrath, which is death."
God says to Adam, "What happened?" Adam says, "Hey, not me. Eve made me do it."
After Adam dies, Eve asks to die too, and God grants her wish, but it's not quite over. According to the book, Michael came and taught Seth how to prepare Eve for burial, and saith, "Lay out in this wise every man that dieth till the day of the resurrection." You would think it would be near impossible to know where the first two people on Earth were buried, even if they did live less than 10,000 years ago, according to creationists. But tradition is clear on exactly where they were laid to rest, and it's the second holiest location in Judaism after the Temple Mount. Called the Cave of Machpelah or the Cave of the Patriarchs, it's located in Hebron, a city in the West Bank. According to the Kabbalah text, the Zohar, after the fall of man, Adam realized that there was a gateway to the Garden of Eden in the ground when he saw light coming from it. He picked that spot as his and Eve's final resting place, digging a cave for the gravesite. When Adam's descendant Abraham stumbled upon the cave, he picked it as his burial site too, as did other Old Testament headliners, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah. That adds up to 4 major Jewish power couples buried in one place, which also happens to be a portal to the Garden of Eden.
That must have been some cave!
The large building that surrounds the graves was built in the 1st century BC by King Herod of baby-killing fame. The location has been under Muslim jurisdiction for about 700 years, and non-Muslims have generally not been allowed into the caves since then, although a few Jews and Christians have managed to sneak in. But if any of them found a way into the Garden of Eden, well, they're not talking